Hi, and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth of York was born in 1466, the eldest child of King Edward IV and his controversial wife Elizabeth Woodville. Her christening was celebrated at Westminster Abbey, sponsored by her grandmothers Jacquetta of Luxembourg, Duchess of Bedford, and Cecily Neville, Duchess of York, who both have their own episodes. Her third sponsor was her father's cousin, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who had been at odds with the king after finding about his secret marriage to the commoner Elizabeth Woodville, hence the controversy. This would have been a peace offering, but not the peace offering it could have been had Elizabeth been a boy. Elizabeth had two half-brothers, Thomas and Richard Grey, from her mother's first marriage. They were 11 and 9 years older than her, respectively. The royal couple kept having children, averaging one about every 18 months. Elizabeth was followed by Mary and then Cecily, but still no boys. This became one of the reasons that Elizabeth's uncle and his cousin rebelled against her father, the king. It was easier to depose a king with no sons, and this king still had no sons. The king's brother would have been next in line to the throne after his three nieces, but England still hadn't been ruled by a queen up to this point. Without a political marriage, Elizabeth probably would not be able to take the throne as a woman. 1470, the queen and her daughters were forced into sanctuary when Elizabeth's father was captured by his brother and his cousins. The little princesses were at that time 4, 2, and 1. The queen herself was pregnant again, and they had to flee on foot from the Tower of London, where they were staying for safety, to Westminster Abbey. That was almost a 3-mile trek. That's about 4.5 kilometers, if that's your choice of measurement. The pregnant queen ran like a 5K while pregnant with 3 daughters, all under the age of 5. And she may have had some assistance, but she definitely didn't own a jogging stroller, so it was quite the ordeal. When the queen arrived at Westminster Abbey, they recognized her as the pious queen who had donated a lot of money to the poor. They didn't want to stick her and her daughters in with the criminals in sanctuary, because the only reason you would plead sanctuary is if you were accused of a crime or in fear of your life. So the royal family was given private lodgings to wait out their sanctuary. This had to be hard for Princess Elizabeth. She was only 4, a preschooler, under a kind of house arrest with her mother and her sisters. They could only wait and hope their father would regroup and come back for them. During this time in sanctuary, they couldn't leave. Being there was potentially the only protection they had. Local merchants donated food for the royal family, but the princesses' lives would have been different than when they had lived in palaces. They were no longer in the royal nursery. They were under house arrest. The queen gave birth in sanctuary to Elizabeth's first little brother, Prince Edward. Her mother would have been busy taking care of her new baby. Queens didn't usually raise their children. If they had been in the palace, the baby would have gone to a royal nursery with a wet nurse. But there weren't wet nurses in sanctuary, so this one was up to the queen. Princess Elizabeth's father was able to regroup several months later after making his first stop to thank God for his victory. His next stop was to get his wife and his now 4 children out of sanctuary. The following decade was filled with more siblings and more rebellions by her father's disappointed family. On the 9th of April, 1483, Elizabeth's father, King Edward IV, died unexpectedly. Edward's health began to fail, and he became subject to an increasing number of ailments. His physicians attributed this in part to a habitual use of emetics, which allowed him to gorge himself at meals and then return after vomiting to start again. Think the Hunger Games capital. If it's starting to sound a little like King Henry VIII, there's a good reason for that. King Edward was the maternal grandfather of King Henry VIII, and it seems as though he took after his grandfather. He fell fatally ill Easter 1483, but survived long enough to add to his will, and the most important thing he added was naming his brother Richard as Lord Protector after his death. Elizabeth's younger brother Edward V ascended the throne, and her uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed regent and Lord Protector of his nephews, as had been stated by the old king in his will. This would prove to be a mistake in hindsight. The king is dead. Long live the king. The queen didn't trust her brother-in-law, and likely still had some latent trauma from her last brother-in-law to take over. She again ran for sanctuary with her surviving children, Elizabeth 17, Mary 15, Cecily 14, Richard 10, Anne 8, Catherine 4, and Bridget 3. This was Elizabeth's second time in sanctuary, hiding from one of her uncles. Her other brother, the king, was 12-year-old Edward, and he was with his uncle and half-brother making their way back to London after news of his father's death, when Richard's men caught up with them and tried to take over custody of the king. Elizabeth's uncle and half-brother were arrested. The king was taken to the Tower of London for safety. Elizabeth's mother still didn't know if she could trust her brother-in-law, and the arrest of her brother and her other sons certainly didn't help. Richard told the queen he could be trusted, and that all he wanted was his nephew on the throne, but that they had to take precautions to keep him safe because he was only 12. That is why he was in the tower, for his protection. Elizabeth's mother allowed her other son to join his brother in sanctuary for company, after Richard said that her other son was lonely. He needed his brother. The council wanted 12-year-old Edward crowned immediately to show the unity and the strength of the royal family. But the king's uncle Richard delayed it. He wasn't sure he could trust his sister-in-law, who was the mother of the young king. She was staying in sanctuary with her daughters, so she wasn't giving off unity vibes. Gloucester took steps to isolate his nephews from their Woodville relations, including their own mother. 2 months later, on the 22nd of June, 1483, Edward IV's marriage was declared invalid. It was claimed that Edward IV had, at the time of his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, already been betrothed to Lady Eleanor Butler. By recognizing this possible marriage with Eleanor, Richard made his nieces and nephews bastards, and not legally able to take the throne. The right of succession reverted to the children of George, 1st Duke of Clarence, another late brother of Gloucester, who had been executed in 1478. Elizabeth's uncle, Anthony Woodville, and her half-brother, Richard Grey, were executed on Richard's orders on the 25th of June. This didn't help the Dowager Queen or her daughters to trust Richard, who, because his other brother George had been bad and executed, it was a whole thing. George's children couldn't take the throne. So Richard III ascended the throne on the 6th of July, 1483, skipping over all of his brother's children. Edward and his brother were taken to the apartments in the inner tower, and then were seen less and less until the end of summer to the autumn of 1483, when they disappeared from public view altogether. They were never seen again. During this time, Mancini records that Edward was regularly visited by a doctor who reported that Edward, like a victim prepared for sacrifice, sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him. It is generally assumed that they were killed on their Uncle Richard's orders. According to only a single, much later Tudor source, Elizabeth's mother made an alliance with Lady Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor, who was in exile, the later King Henry VII, who presented himself as the closest claimant to the throne among the Lancastrian party. Although Henry Tudor was descended from King Edward III through his mother, his claim to the throne was weak, owing to an act of Parliament which barred his accession to the throne because he was descended from a legally legitimized bastard, and the only requirement was that he not claim the throne. And that's exactly what he was doing. Whether such an unprecedented act had force of law is disputed. We are still unclear as to whether the Tudors had a legitimate claim to the throne. They were descended from bastards who had legally been legitimized retroactively by their father, John of Gaunt. Furthermore, there were legitimate Lancastrian lines to the royal houses of Portugal and Castile, so they also had claims to the throne. Whatever the merits of Henry's claim, his mother and Elizabeth Woodville agreed that he should move to claim the throne, and once he had taken it, he should marry Elizabeth of York to boost his feeble claim. Her father had been very popular, and after his recent stunts, her uncle Richard really wasn't. This would hopefully protect both families from the increasingly unstable King Richard III. In December 1483, Henry Tudor swore an oath promising to marry Princess Elizabeth and began planning an invasion. But these were also the old enemies of Elizabeth's father, claiming to protect her from her uncle Richard, so this would have been very confusing for her. Her entire childhood, her father was supported by her uncle Richard. She had no reason to distrust him until her brothers disappeared. But 2 missing children were pretty large red flags. With this plan set into motion, Elizabeth and her sister Cecily left Sanctuary to join court with their uncle Richard. I suspect this was a ploy to lull Richard into a false sense of security. Elizabeth's daughters were now considered adults, and they may have wanted to see what court looked like under their uncle. Henry's mother was also a close friend of Richard's wife Anne, even being the one to carry her train at her coronation. She would have been there also to keep an eye on the York sisters, but they had to be nervous. They were 2 teenagers who until recently had been in a kind of house arrest hiding from the same uncle that they were now moving in with. Richard had started this drama, but women all around him were coming together against him. In 1484, Elizabeth of York and her sister Cecily left Westminster Abbey and returned to court when Elizabeth Woodville was apparently reconciled with Richard III. This may or may not suggest that Elizabeth Woodville believed Richard III to be innocent of any possible role in the murder of her 2 sons. It was rumored that Richard III intended to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York, because his wife, Anne Neville, was dying, and they had no surviving children. Their only son had died the same year that Elizabeth went to court. Richard III denied this unsavory rumor. She was his niece, and he claimed to love his wife, Queen Anne. But Elizabeth did appear in matching dresses with the Queen that had been given to her by her uncle Richard. There have been suggestions that Richard just wanted people to believe he slept with his niece to ruin her for any future political marriages. Or maybe he thought marrying his niece would boost his claim. King Edward's daughter would have boosted just about anyone's claim, even her uncle's. Soon after Anne Neville's death, Richard III sent Elizabeth away from court and opened negotiations with King John II of Portugal to marry his sister, Joan, Princess of Portugal, and to have Elizabeth marry their cousin, the future King Manuel I of Portugal. He needed his niece at least married to an ally, because she had the power to help someone else become king. She was the oldest surviving child of the last king, a very popular king. Her being female was really the only thing stopping her from ruling England. Henry Tudor and his army seized on their moment and landed in Wales on the 7th of August, 1485, and marched inland. Just 2 weeks later, Henry Tudor and Richard III fought at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard III had a larger army, But he was betrayed by one of his most powerful retainers, William Stanley, Henry Tudor's stepfather, and he died in battle. Henry Tudor took the crown by right of conquest as King Henry VII. The king is dead. Long live the king. King Richard III was the last York king. The York dynasty only lasted for one generation, from King Edward to his brother, King Richard. King Henry VII was the first Tudor king. This dynasty wouldn't last much longer, with 3 generations. It will go from King Henry VII to his granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth I. Though initially slow to keep his promise, Henry VII acknowledged the necessity of marrying Elizabeth of York to ensure the stability of his rule and weaken the claims of other surviving members of the House of York. It seemed Henry wished to be seen as ruling in his own right, having claimed the throne by right of conquest, and not by his marriage to the de facto heiress of the House of York. He had no intention of sharing his power. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at longlivethequeenpodcast. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye.